It was a bright morning in Lagos, Nigeria, and the streets were bustling with people, cars honking, and buses packed with passengers eager to start their day. The air was filled with excitement as Christmas approached, and families prepared for the holiday season. Yet, for one family, this December would bring a terrifying twist, a story that would forever change the way they thought about traveling. David and Grace were a young couple with 2 children, a 7-year-old boy named Daniel and a 4-year-old girl named Chinonso. They had planned a trip to visit David's family in Ibadan, a journey they had taken countless times before. However, this December was different. This year, the trip held a heavy weight, a decision they had made without thinking, and one that would later prove to be their biggest mistake. On the eve of their trip, Grace was busy packing their clothes and making sure everything was in order. The children were excited, jumping around the living room, eagerly waiting for the morning. David, on the other hand, was seated in the kitchen, sipping his tea and reading through a few work emails. Everything seemed normal, but as the night deepened, a strange unease settled in his heart. It wasn't that he had doubts about the trip itself. They had taken it many times before. But this time, something felt off. Maybe it was the strange dream he had the night before, something about a warning that seemed too real to ignore. A voice in his dream had told him, "Pray before you travel, David. Pray before you leave your home." At first, David had brushed it off as a silly dream, not worth paying any attention to. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his kitchen, the words echoed in his mind. He looked over at Grace, who was too busy to notice the change in his mood. Was it too late to change their plans? Maybe he was just overthinking things. Still, the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. "Grace," he called softly, trying to get her attention. "Do you think we should pray before we travel tomorrow?" Grace paused and turned around, a little surprised by his request. "Pray? David, we always pray when we leave for a trip. Why the sudden concern?" He hesitated, unsure how to explain the nagging feeling that had settled in his heart. "I don't know. It's just, I had this dream, and it felt real, like a warning. I think we should pray together before we go." Grace smiled warmly, reassuring him. "David, you're overthinking it. It's just the holiday rush getting to you. Don't worry, we'll be fine. Let's pray tomorrow morning before we leave." But David couldn't shake off the feeling. As they went to bed that night, he tried to sleep, but his mind kept racing. The warning in his dream played over and over in his head, "Pray before you leave." He didn't know what to make of it, but it felt important. However, as the night grew later, exhaustion took over, and he fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, the sun rose early, and the family began preparing for their journey. Grace packed the last of the bags. Daniel and Chinonso were ready with their excited smiles, and David still felt the weight of his unease hanging over him. "David, let's go. We'll miss the bus," Grace called from the living room as she checked her phone. David nodded, still uncertain. They had decided to travel by bus since it was more affordable, but as he stood up to join his family, something caught his eye, a picture on the wall. It was a photo of their last trip to Ibadan, a picture of the whole family smiling together, carefree and happy. He glanced back at Grace, who was busy with the children. Maybe he was just being overly cautious. After all, They had made this trip countless times, and nothing had ever gone wrong. But then the dream flashed in his mind again, and for the first time, David felt the weight of his decision to ignore the warning. "Grace, I'm serious about this prayer," David said with urgency. "Can we please pray before we leave?" Grace looked at him with a mixture of concern and confusion but agreed. "Okay, fine, let's pray quickly." As they gathered in the living room, the children knelt beside them, giggling and unaware of the tension in the air. David closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to pray. He asked for God's protection, for a safe journey, and for peace over their family. He prayed as if his life depended on it, as if he knew something he couldn't explain. When the prayer ended, the weight on David's chest lifted slightly, but a new sense of peace filled him. He felt that, no matter what happened on the road, they had done the right thing. With a final hug and kiss for their children, the family left the house and made their way to the bus station. As they arrived, David glanced at the bustling crowd, the long line of people waiting for their buses, and the noise of the city. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, the nagging feeling that had followed him all morning remained. It was around noon when they finally boarded the bus, settling into their seats for the long ride ahead. The bus was crowded, with people from all walks of life, some chatting, some sleeping, others staring out the windows. David and Grace sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, as the bus rumbled along the road toward Ibadan. But little did they know, their journey would soon take a terrifying turn. The bus rumbled down the road, weaving through the crowded streets of Lagos as it headed out of the city toward Ibadan. The hustle and bustle of Lagos were slowly replaced by the quieter, more peaceful landscapes of the countryside. David and Grace sat in silence, still trying to shake off the strange feeling that had haunted David for days. The children were asleep, curled up on their seats, their soft breaths filling the bus with a sense of calm. But despite the calm, David couldn't fully relax. His mind kept replaying the dream, the voice that had warned him to pray before traveling. As the bus moved further from the city, he began to feel an eerie sense of foreboding, a feeling that something was not quite right. Yet, there was no sign of trouble, the bus was still moving smoothly, and the passengers seemed calm. The road ahead was clear, and everything seemed like a normal trip. But then, just as they were approaching a small village, the bus came to a sudden halt. The driver slammed on the brakes, sending a shockwave of confusion and alarm through the passengers. David's heart began to race as he looked around, trying to figure out what was happening. "What's going on?" Grace asked, her voice filled with concern as she looked out the window. David leaned forward, peering out as well. The bus had stopped in the middle of nowhere, and a group of people had gathered on the road ahead, blocking their path. They were shouting and waving their hands, but David couldn't make out what they were saying. The bus driver stepped out to speak with them, but the tension in the air was thick, and David could feel it. It was as if the air had grown heavy, and a sense of dread crept into his heart. Grace looked at him, her face pale, and their children began to stir in their seats, sensing the change in the atmosphere. "I don't like this," Grace whispered, her hand gripping David's. David nodded, his gut telling him that something was wrong. The feeling of unease had shifted into something more sinister. A sudden flash of memory came to him, He had once heard about an incident where a bus traveling through this same route had been hijacked by armed robbers. The thought made his stomach churn. After a few tense minutes, the driver returned to the bus and climbed back into his seat. His face was grim, and the passengers grew anxious, waiting for some explanation. The driver cleared his throat and addressed the passengers in a low voice. "There's a problem ahead," he said, his tone serious. "A group of people is blocking the road. We need to wait for them to clear the way." David exchanged a worried glance with Grace. They had heard stories of roadblocks caused by violent groups in some areas of Nigeria, and the thought of being trapped in the middle of nowhere with 2 young children was terrifying. "What if they don't let us pass?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. David didn't have an answer. He reached for her hand, trying to comfort her, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on him. He glanced at the other passengers, who seemed just as uneasy. Some were praying quietly, while others whispered among themselves, nervously watching the scene outside. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as they waited for the roadblock to be cleared. David's mind raced with thoughts of what could happen next. His earlier concerns about not praying enough before leaving grew stronger. The dream he had that had seemed so distant and insignificant now felt like a warning he had ignored. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, followed by several more. The sound echoed across the road, and the bus jolted, as if something had struck it. Panic erupted inside the vehicle, and the passengers screamed, ducking down in their seats. David's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed Grace and pulled her down to the floor. "What was that?" Grace cried, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know," David shouted back, his mind racing. He felt a cold sweat on his brow, his eyes darting around the bus, trying to make sense of the chaos. The bus driver was shouting at the passengers to stay down, but the sound of gunfire outside was getting louder. The children were crying now, scared and confused. Daniel clung to his mother, his little hands shaking, while Shinonso buried her face in Grace's lap. David felt helpless, his mind spinning with thoughts of what to do. In the midst of the panic, something unexpected happened. The bus, which had been stationary for so long, suddenly lurched forward, jerking back to life. The driver had made a quick decision to escape, driving the bus as fast as he could, weaving in and out of the narrow roads, narrowly avoiding the people who had been blocking the path. David's heart raced as the bus picked up speed, the sounds of gunshots growing fainter in the distance. But the danger wasn't over. The road was narrow and winding, and the bus was careening through it, barely missing other vehicles and obstacles. The passengers screamed as the bus sped through the countryside, the tension thick in the air. "Hold on, everyone," the driver shouted, his voice full of fear. "We're almost out of here." David clutched Grace's hand tightly, his heart in his throat as he prayed silently. He couldn't help but think about how close they had come to disaster. Had they not prayed before leaving, would they have been caught in the ambush? Would they have been among the victims? Just as they were approaching a safer area, the bus screeched to a halt again. This time, it was not because of a roadblock, but because the driver had found a safe place to stop. They were finally out of danger. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, some in tears, David sat back, overwhelmed by the close call. His body was tense, and his mind was still racing. He looked at Grace, who was holding their children tightly. "We are safe," David whispered, his voice shaky. "But I can't help but feel that we were saved for a reason. That prayer we said before leaving. I think it made all the difference." Grace nodded, her face pale but relieved. "David, you were right. We should never take travel lightly. We have to pray every time we leave the house." David's heart swelled with gratitude as he looked out of the window, watching the world go by. They had made it. But the lesson they had learned that day would stay with them forever. Always pray before you travel.